Those crocodile tears are embarrassing, Eleanor. My daughter-in-law whispered those words to me at my husband's funeral while the organ was still playing and the pastor was asking everyone to bow their heads in prayer. For a moment, I honestly thought I had heard her wrong. Maybe grief had distorted the sound. Maybe exhaustion had finally broken something inside my 72-year-old mind. But when I turned toward Vanessa, she was smiling. Not kindly, not nervously, calmly, like a woman who had been waiting years to say exactly what she truly thought of me. The church suddenly felt colder than the November air outside. My husband Richard Whitmore had been dead for exactly 6 days, and already the people sitting behind me seemed less interested in mourning him than watching the quiet war unfolding between his widow and his daughter-in-law. I kept my eyes forward. That was the strange thing about grief. People expect you to collapse dramatically, but real grief is quieter than that. It settles into your bones like winter. It makes even breathing feel heavy. I folded my black gloves carefully into my lap and stared at the white lilies surrounding Richard's casket. He had always hated lilies. Funeral flowers shouldn't smell sweeter than weddings. He used to joke every spring when we passed the flower market downtown. For 43 years, that man could make me laugh in the middle of almost anything. Now the church echoed with polite coughing, soft crying, and the distant sound of rain tapping against stained glass windows, while my son Daniel sat 3 feet away pretending not to hear his wife humiliate me. That hurt more than Vanessa's words ever could. Daniel used to worship his father. As a little boy, he followed Richard everywhere. Into the garage, onto the sailboat, around the backyard while Richard trimmed hedges every Sunday morning, wearing those ridiculous khaki shorts he refused to throw away. But somewhere over the years, my son had slowly stopped looking at his father for guidance and started looking at Vanessa instead. She had a way of taking over rooms without raising her voice. Everything about her appeared polished. Perfect blonde hair. Perfect cream-colored coat. Perfect smile that never reached her eyes. Even now, at a funeral, she looked less like a grieving daughter-in-law and more like a woman attending a country club luncheon she didn't particularly enjoy. When the service ended, people formed a line to offer condolences. I shook hands mechanically while Daniel stood beside Vanessa greeting business associates like they were hosting a charity gala. Then I overheard her speaking softly to one of Richard's former partners near the church doors. The estate will probably take months to sort out, she sighed dramatically. Honestly, Eleanor can barely manage the house alone now. We're already discussing what's best for her. What's best for me? I nearly laughed out loud at the arrogance of it. Richard had not even been buried yet, and already Vanessa was speaking as if my life had become a problem waiting to be managed. Outside, cold rain soaked the cemetery grass as the pallbearers prepared to move Richard's casket into the hearse. I stepped forward one last time to touch the polished wood. My fingers trembled against the surface. Not because of Vanessa, not because of Daniel, because this was the final time I would ever stand beside the man who built my entire world with me. Then, as I pulled my hand away, my fingers brushed against something inside Richard's coat pocket draped carefully beside the casket flowers. Confused, I slipped my hand inside and felt cold metal pressing against my palm. A small brass key attached to a faded handwritten tag. Cedar Room. My heartbeat stopped instantly because 20 years ago, Richard locked one room in our basement and told me never to open it unless something happened to him. Behind me, Vanessa's voice floated through the rain again, smooth as silk. Once everything transfers over, we can finally renovate the property. I slowly closed my hand around the key, and for the first time since my husband died, I realized Richard may not have left me defenseless after all. The rain followed me all the way home from the cemetery, streaking across the windshield in slow gray lines, while the windshield wipers clicked back and forth like a metronome counting down the final moments of the life I used to have. Daniel and Vanessa drove behind me in Richard's black Mercedes, and every time I glanced into the rearview mirror, I could see Vanessa talking with animated little hand gestures while my son nodded beside her like an obedient employee listening to instructions from his supervisor. By the time we pulled into the circular driveway of our Connecticut home, dusk had settled over the property. The house looked enormous in the fading light. Too quiet. Too still. Richard and I bought that colonial house 36 years ago when Daniel was 8 years old. Back then, the front porch needed repairs. The roof leaked near the upstairs guest room, and the garden beds were nothing but weeds and cracked stone edging. But Richard loved it immediately. "This house has good bones," he told me the day we first toured it. He used to say the same thing about people. Standing there now with rain soaking through the hem of my black coat, I suddenly understood how empty good bones could feel after the soul left them behind. Vanessa walked past me carrying her designer handbag tucked neatly beneath one arm while speaking into her phone. "Yes, probably by spring," she said casually. "The property value alone is unbelievable." She stopped when she noticed me watching her. "Oh, Eleanor, I was just talking to Melissa about how difficult this transition must be for you." Her voice softened artificially on the word difficult. Everything about Vanessa sounded rehearsed, even sympathy. I nodded politely and stepped inside the house without answering. The familiar scent of cedarwood and Richard's coffee beans still lingered faintly in the air. For one irrational moment, I expected to hear his footsteps in the kitchen or the sound of his evening jazz station playing softly from the study. Instead, there was only silence broken by the distant clicking of Vanessa's heels against hardwood floors as she wandered through the house, like a realtor inspecting a future listing. Daniel loosened his tie and disappeared into the kitchen without looking at me. That hurt more than anything Vanessa had done all day. Grief changes people, but cowardice reveals them. I quietly removed my coat and slipped the brass key deeper into my sweater pocket before anyone could notice it. Cedar room. The words kept echoing inside my mind. Richard had locked that room shortly after Daniel left for law school. I remembered asking him once why he suddenly needed privacy in a house where we had shared everything for decades. He kissed my forehead and smiled sadly. "Some things need to stay protected until the right time." At the time, I assumed he meant business documents or old family records. Now I was no longer sure. I walked into the kitchen and stopped short when I saw Vanessa already sitting at the island counter with a yellow legal pad in front of her. She had divided the page into neat little sections. Renovations, estate, storage, realtor contacts. My stomach tightened. Richard had not even been gone a full day from this house, and already she was organizing his life into categories. "Daniel and I were thinking," she began brightly. "The upstairs master suite could use a complete remodel if we decide to stay here permanently." If we decide to stay here permanently. The words landed gently, but their meaning was sharp as broken glass. I opened the refrigerator slowly, mostly to avoid looking at her. Richard's favorite strawberry yogurt still sat on the top shelf beside the half-finished bottle of creamer he used every morning. Tiny ordinary things suddenly felt unbearable. "I am not going anywhere," I said quietly. Vanessa laughed softly like I had made a charming little joke. "Of course not immediately, Eleanor. But eventually this house will become too much for one person to manage alone." I closed the refrigerator door carefully. "Richard managed it with me for decades." "Yes," she replied smoothly. "But Richard is gone now." The kitchen fell silent. Even Daniel stopped moving for a second. I looked at my son, waiting for him to say something. Anything. Instead, he stared down into his coffee cup. That was when I finally understood something painful and simple. Vanessa was not the real reason my family was falling apart. She was only the person bold enough to say aloud what Daniel had already allowed to happen. Later that evening, after everyone went upstairs, I stood alone in the dark hallway outside the basement door with the brass key cold in my hand. Somewhere above me, I could hear Vanessa laughing softly in my bedroom. For almost an hour, I stood in the dark hallway staring at the basement door while the rest of the house settled into uneasy silence around me. The grandfather clock near the staircase ticked steadily. Slow, heavy. The same clock Richard wound every Sunday evening for more than 30 years. Funny how grief makes you notice sounds you stopped hearing long ago. My fingers tightened around the brass key inside my sweater pocket. Upstairs, I could hear muffled footsteps moving across the second floor. Vanessa had already claimed the master bedroom without asking. I realized that when I heard drawers opening and closing above me, followed by the unmistakable scrape of luggage wheels against hardwood floors. She was unpacking. In my bedroom, less than 12 hours after my husband's funeral. I closed my eyes for a moment and leaned against the hallway wall. Richard used to stand in this exact spot every Christmas morning waiting for Daniel to race downstairs as a little boy. Our son would come barreling around the corner in footed pajamas while Richard pretended Santa Claus had eaten all the cookies personally. Back then, this house felt warm, alive, full of ordinary happiness. Now every memory felt like touching glass with bare hands in winter. I finally unlocked the basement door and stepped carefully down the narrow wooden stairs. The air smelled cool and dry, carrying the faint scent of cedarwood and old paper. Richard always kept the basement spotless. Even after retirement, he organized every toolbox, every fishing rod, every storage bin with military precision. Halfway down the stairs, I stopped when I noticed something strange. A thin line of warm light glowed beneath the old cedar room door at the far end of the basement hallway. My heartbeat quickened instantly. That room had remained locked for 2 decades. No windows, no electricity connected according to Richard. Yet light flickered beneath the door now like someone had been inside recently. I walked closer slowly, my slippers barely making a sound against the concrete floor. The brass key felt colder in my hand now, almost heavy. For one irrational second, I actually wondered if Richard himself had somehow left the light on before he died. Grief does strange things to the mind. It turns impossible thoughts into comforting ones. I slid the key carefully into the lock. The mechanism clicked immediately like it had been waiting for me. Inside, the room smelled strongly of cedar and dust. A single desk lamp illuminated the center of the room, casting warm golden light across shelves lined with black storage boxes, legal binders, and neatly labeled file folders. My breath caught in my throat. Richard had built an entire hidden office beneath our home. There were photographs pinned carefully to a corkboard, printed emails, financial statements, handwritten notes in Richard's unmistakable neat block lettering. At the center of the desk sat an old video player beside several tapes labeled with dates stretching back nearly 7 years. 7 years. My husband had been hiding something for 7 years beneath our feet while we ate dinner upstairs pretending everything in our family was normal. Then I saw her name, Vanessa Whitmore. It appeared over and over across folders stacked in precise rows. Insurance records, bank transfers, property documents. I slowly opened the top file and immediately recognized Daniel's signature on several pages. My stomach tightened as I scanned the numbers. Large withdrawals, unknown accounts, payments redirected through shell companies. I did not understand every detail immediately, but one thing became painfully clear very quickly. Richard had not been paranoid. He had been preparing. Suddenly, footsteps echoed above me from the kitchen floor overhead. Then Vanessa's laugh drifted faintly through the ceiling. Honestly, Daniel, your mother is going to need professional help managing this place. Professional help. I stared down at the folder in my trembling hands while something cold and sharp settled quietly inside my chest. Not anger. Anger burns hot and fast. This felt different. Clearer. Like finally seeing the shape of something. Dangerous hiding beneath still water. I reached for the nearest videotape and froze when I noticed Richard had written something else beneath my name in black marker. If Vanessa starts searching for the second key, do not trust anyone. Even Daniel. I do not know how long I stood inside that cedar room staring at my husband's secrets spread across the desk beneath the soft yellow glow of the lamp. Minutes felt strange after loss. Sometimes they dragged painfully slow. Other times entire hours vanished without warning. The basement was silent except for the faint hum of the old video player and the distant sound of rain tapping softly against the small ground-level window near the ceiling. I carefully opened another folder with Vanessa's name written across the front in Richard's handwriting. Inside were photographs from charity events, country club dinners, and business parties stretching back years. At first they looked harmless. Vanessa smiling beside Daniel. Vanessa speaking with investors. Vanessa standing near Richard during foundation galas. But then I noticed something unsettling. In every photograph, her attention was never truly on the person beside her. Her eyes always seemed focused somewhere else. Watching, measuring, calculating. Richard once told me there are people who walk into a room searching for connection and others who walk into a room searching for advantage. At the time, I thought he was talking about business. Now I understood he had been talking about her. I sat slowly in Richard's old leather chair behind the desk and closed my eyes for a moment as memories began drifting back differently now. Tiny moments I dismissed for years suddenly rearranged themselves into something clearer. The Christmas Vanessa convinced Daniel to cancel our annual ski trip because she claimed luxury cabins were wasteful. 2 weeks later, she posted photographs online from a private resort in Aspen with her own friends. The The summer barbecue where she casually joked in front of guests that old houses become money pits once the original owners are gone. The uncomfortable silence afterward. Richard's expression tightening beside me while Daniel laughed, nervously like a boy desperate to avoid conflict. I remembered the way Richard started staying awake later at night after Vanessa entered our family. Sometimes I would wake around 2 in the morning and find light glowing beneath his study door. He always smiled when I asked if something was wrong. Just organizing paperwork, he would say. I believed him because after 43 years of marriage, trust becomes automatic, like breathing. Yet sitting there now surrounded by hidden files and years of quiet investigation, I realized my husband had been carrying fear alone for a very long time. I reached for one of the videotapes and slid it carefully into the player. Static flickered across the screen for several seconds before Richard appeared seated exactly where I sat now. His navy sweater looked slightly wrinkled, and there were dark circles beneath his eyes I never noticed before. He stared directly into the camera for a moment before speaking. "Eleanor, if you are watching this, then events unfolded exactly the way I feared they would." His voice was calm, steady, but underneath it, I could hear exhaustion. I wanted to believe Daniel would eventually see Vanessa clearly. I truly did. But love mixed with weakness can become dangerous. My chest tightened hearing him speak like this. Not as my husband, not as Daniel's father, but as a man preparing evidence before disappearing. Richard lowered his eyes briefly toward papers on the desk before continuing. "There are things hidden inside this room that cannot fall into Vanessa's hands. Especially the second key. The second key again." I leaned closer instinctively. "If she finds it, everything I protected will disappear before you understand what she has already done." Suddenly, the video cut abruptly to static. I frowned and pressed the rewind button, but before I could restart the tape, I heard something upstairs. A soft creak. Then another. Slow footsteps crossing the kitchen floor directly above the basement. I froze immediately. The footsteps stopped. Silence filled the house again for several long seconds before Vanessa's voice floated faintly through the ceiling. "Daniel, have you seen your mother?" I quickly ejected the tape and slid it back into the drawer just as another sound echoed downstairs. The basement door upstairs had opened. I switched off the desk lamp so quickly that the room disappeared into darkness around me. My pulse hammered painfully against my ribs while I stood frozen beside Richard's chair listening to the slow footsteps above. The old house carried sound strangely at night. Every creak seemed louder after loss, more dangerous somehow. I slipped the videotape back into the drawer and carefully closed the file folders spread across the desk, trying to leave everything exactly as I found it. Then I heard the basement stairs groan softly. Someone was coming down. For one irrational second, I felt like a stranger hiding inside my own home. The narrow strip of light from the basement hallway stretched across the floor as the door upstairs opened wider. "Eleanor," Daniel called softly. His voice sounded tired, hesitant. "Are you down here?" I exhaled slowly, forcing my hands to stop trembling before stepping out of the cedar room and locking the door behind me. By the time Daniel reached the bottom step, I was standing near the laundry shelves holding an empty storage bin as though I had wandered downstairs searching for old winter blankets. He looked relieved when he saw me, though guilt still clung to his expression like damp fog. "Vanessa thought maybe you left the house," he said quietly. I studied my son's face carefully beneath the dim basement light. At 44, Daniel looked more like Richard every year. Same broad shoulders, same dark eyes, same habit of rubbing the back of his neck when uncomfortable. But Richard had never carried this kind of weakness in his posture. "I needed some air," I replied calmly. Daniel glanced around the basement distractedly. "You should try to get some rest tonight, Mom. It has been a long day." Mom, not Eleanor like Vanessa preferred. The word almost sounded genuine. Almost. Upstairs, I could hear Vanessa moving through the kitchen cabinets. Doors opening. Dishes clinking softly. Already rearranging things. I followed Daniel back upstairs slowly, one hand gripping the basement railing while my thoughts spiraled through everything I had just discovered. The hidden files. The recordings. The warning about the second key. Richard had not spent 7 years documenting small family disagreements. This was something larger. Something serious enough to terrify him. The kitchen lights were still on when we returned upstairs. Vanessa stood barefoot near the marble island wearing one of my cashmere cardigans wrapped loosely around her shoulders. My cardigan. The pale blue one Richard bought me during our anniversary trip to Nantucket 8 years ago. She smiled the moment she saw me, but her eyes immediately drifted toward the basement door behind Daniel. There you are, she said lightly. We were starting to worry. Her voice carried that same polished sweetness she used around wealthy donors and country club women she secretly disliked. I walked toward the sink without responding and poured myself a glass of water. My hands felt steadier now. Strange how quickly fear changes once confusion turns into understanding. Vanessa leaned casually against the counter. Daniel and I were discussing some practical things tonight. Practical things. Wealthy people always use gentle words when discussing ugly intentions. There are so many responsibilities attached to a property this size, she continued smoothly, especially for someone living alone. I took a slow sip of water and looked directly at her for the first time since the funeral. I am not alone. Something flickered briefly across her face, then vanished. Irritation. Surprise. Perhaps both. Daniel shifted awkwardly beside her. Vanessa only means we want to help. Help. The same way wolves help wounded animals survive winter. Vanessa walked toward the kitchen table where several papers were spread neatly beside her laptop. Real estate listings. Renovation estimates. Tax assessments. My stomach tightened again when I noticed one document already labeled Whitmore Property Transfer Timeline. Richard had not even been buried yet. You have both been very busy today, I said quietly. Vanessa smiled again. Richard would have wanted us to stay organized. No, Richard would have wanted dignity, respect, time to grieve. But Vanessa treated death the way some people treat business mergers. An inconvenience followed by opportunity. Then my eyes landed on something near her laptop that made my blood run cold. Resting beside her phone was another brass key nearly identical to the one hidden inside my sweater pocket. For a moment, I could not breathe. My eyes stayed fixed on the brass key beside Vanessa's laptop, while every warning Richard recorded downstairs echoed through my mind all over again. If she finds the second key. Vanessa noticed my expression immediately. She always noticed weakness in people the way sharks notice blood in water. Her fingers moved casually toward the key, almost protective. Oh, she said lightly, following my gaze. I found this in one of Richard's desk drawers upstairs. Strange little thing, is it not? My heartbeat slowed instead of quickening. That surprised me. Earlier that evening, I still felt like a grieving widow stumbling through fog. But now something inside me had sharpened. Richard spent years preparing for this moment. I realized that much with absolute certainty. He knew Vanessa would start searching almost immediately after his death. He knew Daniel would not stop her. And somehow, he trusted me to finish whatever he started. I placed my water glass carefully into the sink before speaking. Richard kept many things private toward the end. Vanessa tilted her head slightly. That must have been difficult for you. There it was again. That carefully polished cruelty wrapped inside fake concern. Daniel rubbed his tired eyes and glanced toward the staircase. Maybe we should all get some sleep tonight. Vanessa ignored him completely. I was actually thinking tomorrow we should begin sorting through Richard's office. Her fingers tapped lightly against the brass key beside her computer. There are probably documents that need immediate attention. Immediate attention. The woman spoke about grief the way accountants speak about overdue taxes. I watched Daniel carefully then, waiting. Hoping perhaps some small part of the boy I raised still existed beneath all this weakness and silence. Your father hated when people rushed through his things, I said quietly. Daniel looked uncomfortable immediately because he knew it was true. Richard kept handwritten notes inside almost every book he owned. Old receipts tucked into travel guides. Tiny anniversary cards hidden in dresser drawers years after I gave them to him. To Richard, objects carried memory, meaning. But Vanessa smiled smoothly before Daniel could answer. Of course, she said. Nobody wants to disrespect Richard's memory. We are simply trying to protect the estate. Protect the estate. Not protect the family. Not protect me. I suddenly understood that Vanessa stopped seeing us as people long ago. To her, everything had become assets. Property. Access. Opportunity. She picked up the brass key and turned it slowly between perfectly manicured fingers. Honestly, old houses like this usually hide all sorts of secrets. The sentence sounded casual, but something cold moved beneath her tone. She was fishing, watching me carefully for a reaction. I forced myself to remain still. Richard always valued privacy, I replied. Vanessa smiled wider. That must be why he changed so many passwords recently. My stomach tightened instantly. She knew more than I thought. Daniel frowned slightly beside her. What passwords? Vanessa waved dismissively. Nothing important. Your father just became unusually secretive these past few years. Secretive? No. Careful. There is a difference. I excused myself quietly and walked toward the staircase before either of them could continue. Halfway upstairs, I paused when I heard Vanessa lower her voice in the kitchen below. She knows something, she whispered. Daniel sounded exhausted. Vanessa, please. Not tonight. You saw her face when she looked at the key. Silence followed. Then Vanessa spoke again, softer this time. Richard hid things from us, Daniel. I know he did. I continued upstairs slowly without making a sound. My bedroom door stood partially open at the end of the hallway, warm light spilling across the carpet. Our bedroom. Not hers. Mine and Richard's. Yet traces of Vanessa already covered the space. Her expensive perfume lingered faintly in the air. One of her silk blouses hung carelessly across the chair near the fireplace. A cosmetic bag rested beside my jewelry box. She was settling into my life inch by inch while pretending she was helping me survive it. I opened Richard's closet quietly and stared at the row of neatly pressed jackets still hanging exactly where he left them. Then my eyes landed on something unusual tucked behind his winter coats. A small locked metal box I had never seen before. Attached to the handle was a handwritten note in Richard's unmistakable careful script. Eleanor, open this before Vanessa finds the truth about Daniel. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the small metal box from the back of Richard's closet. It was heavier than it looked, cold against my palms, with tiny scratches along the corners like it had been opened and closed many times over the years. I carried it carefully to the bed and sat down on the edge of the mattress that still smelled faintly like Richard's cologne. The room felt painfully unfamiliar now, not because Richard was gone, but because grief had exposed how many invisible fractures already existed inside this family long before the funeral flowers arrived. Downstairs, I could still hear Vanessa moving through the kitchen. Cabinet doors opening, glasses clinking softly. The sounds of someone settling comfortably into a life that did not belong to her. I stared at the handwritten note attached to the box for a long moment before finally opening it. Inside were several sealed envelopes, a flash drive, and one thick folder labeled Daniel. My chest tightened instantly. Richard never dramatized things, never exaggerated. If he hid something like this from me, it was because he truly believed I would need protection from the truth itself. I slowly opened the folder and immediately recognized copies of financial statements from Daniel's law firm accounts. Large amounts of money had been transferred repeatedly over the past 3 years into private investment groups connected to Vanessa's brother in Miami. The totals made my stomach turn. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. I kept reading. Loan documents, credit lines, property liens. Then I found a handwritten note from Richard, clipped neatly to the top page. Eleanor, Daniel does not know the full extent of what Vanessa has involved him in. He believes he is protecting his marriage. He does not realize he is risking everything. I closed my eyes briefly as a deep ache settled into my chest. Richard had always protected Daniel. Even now, after years of deception, he still wrote about our son with compassion instead of anger. That was the difference between Richard and Vanessa. One saw weakness and wanted to shield it. The other saw weakness and used it. I reached for the flash drive next and noticed another envelope beneath it labeled for Eleanor only. My fingers hesitated before opening it carefully. Inside was a letter written entirely in Richard's handwriting. The paper smelled faintly of cedar and old ink. Eleanor, if you are reading this, then I am sorry. Sorry for leaving you alone to finish something I should have handled myself years ago. I wanted to believe Vanessa would eventually show Daniel enough kindness for him to wake up on his own. Instead, she slowly isolated him from everyone who truly loved him. My eyes blurred for a moment, but I forced myself to keep reading. There are accounts and properties connected to Daniel's name that he never fully reviewed himself. Vanessa managed everything financial once he became partner at the firm. She counted on his trust. She counted on his exhaustion. And worst of all, she counted on his silence. Silence. That word hit me hardest because Richard was right. Daniel had spent years avoiding conflict, while Vanessa quietly expanded her control over every part of his life. The same way she was now trying to take control of mine. Suddenly, headlights swept briefly across the bedroom curtains from outside. A car pulling into the driveway. I quickly folded the letter and crossed toward the window. My pulse quickened again when I recognized the dark sedan stopping near the front entrance. Harold Bennett stepped out holding a leather briefcase beneath one arm. Richard's attorney. Even at nearly 75 years old, Harold still carried himself with the same calm authority that made judges nervous and dishonest businessmen sweat through. Expensive suits. He looked up toward the house with an expression I could not immediately read. Concern perhaps, or urgency. Downstairs, the front door opened before Harold even reached the porch. Vanessa must have been watching for him. I could not hear every word clearly from upstairs, but her voice carried enough through the hallway. It is a little late for legal meetings, Harold. Then came Harold's calm reply. I am not here for you, Vanessa. Silence followed briefly before he added something that made my blood run cold all over again. Richard instructed me to speak with Eleanor immediately if anyone started searching for the second vault. The house became completely silent after Harold spoke those words. Even from upstairs, I could feel the tension settle across the rooms like heavy smoke. Second vault. So Richard had hidden more than files and videotapes. My fingers tightened around the letter while I listened carefully from the hallway outside the bedroom. Vanessa recovered first. She always did. I have no idea what you are talking about, she said smoothly downstairs, though her voice sounded tighter now. Harold did not answer immediately. That silence alone told me everything. Richard trusted Harold completely. If he came to the house in the middle of the night carrying a leather briefcase after the funeral, then whatever was hidden inside that second vault was important enough to frighten even him. I slipped Richard's letter back into the metal box and locked it carefully before hiding everything beneath folded blankets inside the closet storage bench. Then I straightened my sweater, wiped the exhaustion from my face as best I could, and walked downstairs slowly. Harold stood near the front entrance still wearing his charcoal overcoat dampened by rain. His silver hair looked slightly windblown, but his sharp blue eyes remained calm and alert as they landed on me. Vanessa stood beside the staircase with her arms crossed tightly. Daniel hovered awkwardly near the kitchen doorway, looking completely overwhelmed. Eleanor, Harold said gently, I apologize for the late hour. I nodded faintly. You rarely apologize unless something serious is happening. A shadow passed briefly across Harold's face. Richard used to joke that Harold only had two expressions in 50 years. Concerned and more concerned. Tonight, he looked deeply troubled. Vanessa stepped forward before either of us could continue. I really think legal matters can wait until tomorrow morning. Harold turned toward her slowly. Richard specifically instructed me not to wait if anyone started looking for the second vault before the reading of the trust. The word trust visibly unsettled Daniel. Dad never mentioned any second vault, he said quietly. Harold studied him for a long moment before replying carefully. Your father stopped discussing certain matters openly once he realized sensitive information inside this family was no longer secure. The room fell silent again. Vanessa's jaw tightened slightly, though her smile remained perfectly controlled. That sounds dramatic, she said lightly. Harold ignored her completely and focused on me instead. Richard left additional instructions that only you are authorized to hear, Eleanor. Vanessa stepped closer instantly. I am Daniel's wife. Anything involving this family concerns both of us. Harold's expression did not change. Not according to Richard. Those four words landed harder than shouting ever could. Daniel looked between them nervously. Harold, what exactly is going on? Harold removed a sealed envelope from his briefcase. Richard's handwriting covered the front in dark blue ink. For Eleanor only. Do not open in front of Vanessa. My pulse quickened immediately. Vanessa noticed the writing too. Something sharp flashed across her face before disappearing beneath another polished smile. Honestly, she laughed softly, Richard became so paranoid these past few years. Harold's eyes finally moved toward her then, cold and direct. No, Vanessa. Richard became careful. The entire kitchen seemed to freeze after that. Even Daniel looked startled hearing someone speak to his wife that way. Vanessa folded her arms tighter across her chest. I think everyone here is exhausted and emotional. Perhaps, Harold replied calmly. But emotional people rarely create encrypted financial records, private vaults, and emergency legal directives spread across 3 states. Daniel went pale instantly. 3 states. I watched my son carefully then, because for the first time all night, genuine fear appeared on his face instead of confusion. Not fear of grief. Not fear of losing his father. Fear of discovering how much had been hidden from him. Harold turned back toward me. Eleanor, Richard instructed me to ask you one question before I say anything else. He paused briefly while rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows. Has Vanessa found the second key yet? Slowly, very slowly, my eyes shifted toward the brass key still resting beside Vanessa's laptop on the kitchen table. Harold followed my gaze immediately, and for the first time since arriving, the calm expression on his face completely disappeared. Vanessa's hand moved instinctively toward the brass key on the table the moment Harold's eyes landed on it. Not quickly, not dramatically. That was what made it unsettling. She moved like someone protecting something she already believed belonged to her. Harold stared at the key for several long seconds before slowly removing his glasses. I had known Harold Bennett for almost 40 years, and in all that time, I had only seen him truly shaken twice. Once when Richard nearly died during a boating accident off Cape Cod years ago. And now, where exactly did you find that? He asked quietly. Vanessa lifted her chin slightly. In Richard's office upstairs. What? Harold did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward me with something close to regret in his expression. Richard hoped this would not happen before the trust meeting. Daniel frowned in confusion. Somebody needs to explain what is going on. Harold placed his briefcase carefully on the kitchen table beside the scattered real estate papers Vanessa had been reviewing earlier that evening. Seeing Richard's lifelong attorney standing beside renovation estimates and property transfer documents felt strangely symbolic somehow. One man protecting a family legacy. The other woman trying to strip it for parts before the funeral flowers even wilted. Harold opened the briefcase slowly and removed a thick sealed packet. Your father established several legal contingencies over the last 5 years, he said calmly to Daniel. Most of them activated only under very specific conditions. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. This is ridiculous. Richard was old, grieving, and paranoid after his health started failing. Harold's eyes hardened instantly. Your father-in-law was one of the sharpest men I have ever represented. Silence settled heavily across the kitchen again. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows while the grandfather clock ticked steadily from the hallway. Daniel looked exhausted now, pale, confused. Dad never mentioned any of this to me, he whispered. Harold looked directly at him then. That was intentional. The words seemed to physically hit my son. I watched his shoulders stiffen slightly as understanding began creeping slowly across his face. Not full understanding yet, but enough to frighten him. Harold slid the sealed packet toward me across the table. Richard instructed me to give this only to you if Vanessa ever obtained the second key before the formal reading of the trust. Vanessa immediately stepped closer. You keep talking about this key like it unlocks something important. Harold nodded once. It does. Her eyes sharpened instantly. There it was again. That hunger she tried so carefully to hide beneath elegance and composure. Then perhaps we should all hear this together, she suggested smoothly. Harold ignored her completely and turned toward me instead. Eleanor, before you open that packet, there is something you need to understand. His voice lowered slightly. Richard believed someone inside this family had been moving money, properties, and corporate assets through Daniel's name without fully informing him. Daniel stared at Harold in disbelief. What are you talking about? Harold opened another folder from the briefcase and placed several documents onto the kitchen island beneath the overhead lights. Bank transfers, property acquisitions, investment accounts. I recognized some of the same documents Richard had hidden downstairs inside the cedar room. Over $8 million passed through. Shell entities connected to Vanessa's family during the last 3 years, Harold said carefully. The color drained completely from Daniel's face. Vanessa laughed softly, though the sound came out strained. That is absurd. Harold slid one final document across the counter toward Daniel. Your signature appears on every authorization. Daniel picked up the paper with visibly trembling hands. No, he whispered after several seconds. I never approved this. Vanessa stepped beside him immediately. Daniel, do not let them manipulate you while you are grieving. But Daniel was no longer looking at Harold. Or me. He was staring directly at his wife now, like a man seeing a stranger standing inside his own home. Then Harold spoke the sentence Richard must have spent years preparing him to hear. Your father believed Vanessa planned to liquidate the Whitmore estate completely once Eleanor was removed from legal control of the trust. Nobody moved after that. Nobody even seemed to breathe. And slowly, almost carefully, Daniel lowered the documents onto the kitchen table before asking the question that finally shattered whatever remained of his marriage. Vanessa, what exactly did you do?